Yo, how's it going? Homelessness in America, it's gotten pretty bad, and so I kind of want to take a nice look into it, and then next is like how Finland solved their homeless problems. So let's see what happens.
The homeless crisis in America is worsening again. The COVID pandemic caused a surge in housing costs and a rise in unemployment, leaving nearly 600,000 Americans unhoused in 2020.
We have to shut down a piece of our own humanity to be able to walk past another human being that is in such difficult situation.
And being homeless, your days anywhere spent from where I'm going to lay my head at tonight, where I'm going to get my next bite of food from.
And what people
Mm.
don't typically realize when they walk past a person who's homeless is that this person is costing taxpayers a lot of money.
Cities across America are spending more than ever to combat the crisis. In 2019, New York spent a record-breaking $3 billion to support its homeless population. California is also expected to break its record, allocating $4.8 billion of its budget to the same issue
Wow.
over the next 2 years.
And areas like that just don't seem to be getting any better, despite the fact that every politician claims that this is a top priority of theirs and the budgets keep going up.
Overall, homelessness in America has only improved 10% compared to 2007.
Ten
It's even
percent.
worse for certain subgroups such as individual homelessness, which dropped only 1% in the same period. On the contrary, 2020 saw a 30% increase in the unsheltered homeless, erasing
Wow.
over half a decade of work since its dramatic rise in 2015.
Right now, we're trending in the wrong direction. So the state of homelessness right now is pretty tenuous, and there are some small increases that are taking place across the board.
So, how is the US addressing the homeless crisis? And can it ever be solved?
That is a good question.
Homelessness is known to prey on some of the most vulnerable populations in America. In 2020, 20% of those who were unhoused suffered from severe mental disorders, while 16% suffered from chronic substance abuse. In response, the US has long relied on a housing-ready approach to homelessness, where those who are unhoused had to meet specific requirements such as sobriety or completion of treatment in order to qualify for a home. That was until this man, Dr. Sam Simbaris, pioneered the Housing First initiative.
At some point, myself and the people we were working with realized that really insisting that people change, get sober, take medication, get your life together in order to earn or be awarded housing was not working. You just, people couldn't. People were on the street. They couldn't stay sober. They were not interested in medication. They were interested in being somewhere safe and secure.
The Housing First
Okay, yeah,
initiative
that's
follows
true.
two tenets.
Yeah.
First, the most effective solution to homelessness is permanent housing. And second, all housing for the homeless should be provided immediately, without any preconditions.
Putting people in housing first, which is what they were desperate to do, calms that survival thing, and people are safe, secure, and then they're saying to us, I need more help here. So then rather than having it us pushing or coercing people to get to treatment, people get housing and then they want treatment.
Under the George W. Bush administration, the Housing
Sounds
First
reasonable.
initiative gained the spotlight as the key to ending homelessness.
Wow, George Bush.
Related programs soon received
pushed that out.
billions of dollars in support from government agencies such as the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness and the Department of Housing and Urban Development.
Housing First's rise really begins in the 90s, especially in the late 90s, and I think it really gained traction as the philosophy that should dominate those dedicated homeless services agencies and programs. And so we're in a situation now where you meet people who work at HUD on homelessness or in major agencies in California and New York. It's relatively rare to not find them be committed to housing first.
If you really look at it, this year, the federal government will give about 2.7 billion to housing and service providers and housing and cities across the country.
For
Okay.
decades, the Housing First policy has successfully housed individuals that need it the most. Shannon McGee is one of them. A
Okay.
nonprofit organization, Pathways to Housing, helped Shannon move into his supportive housing in 2020 after staying unhoused for 4 years.
It started in 2008, losing my mom to lung cancer, and
Wow.
then not having a strong support system to support me throughout the process. I ended up losing the family house. They sold the family house and didn't have anywhere to go. And that started the stint of being homeless. From being housed to now being unhoused, the shelter for me was very hard to, it was a culture shock. It was very hard to adjust to the environment, the living standards. I finally got connected to the Veteran Affairs, and a social worker with them connected me to Pathways. And since being connected to Pathways, everything has turned around 360 degrees. I'm housed. I'm looking for gainful employment. I'm in school now, so and not without having Pathways there to kind of be that support and that coach to guide me into housing, I wouldn't be where I'm at now.
A study in 2004 discovered that when individuals were provided with stable, affordable housing with services under their control, 79% remained stably housed at the end of 6 months. Another study in 2000 found it to be more effective than traditional programs. 88% of the participants in Housing First programs remain housed, compared to just
88%?
47% in the city's residential treatment program.
Wow,
And
dude.
it's not
That's a
just in
huge
the United
difference.
States. A similar study conducted in Canada revealed similar results, showing participants of Housing First programs obtaining and retaining housing at a much higher rate.
The evidence has shown that by getting people housed immediately and eliminating the chaos of homelessness, created a space where people would be more successful.
I don't have to be in that environment anymore where I'm subjected to using drugs or to doing things for money that I didn't want to do.
That's a huge
I can
difference
change
right there. That
my focus is now I can say, hey, you're housed. How can we get you to your next level of finding gainful employment? What steps can we work on now?
big
Housing
facts.
First not only supports those in need with housing, but the assistance
Yeah,
they
it just
need to get back
takes
on
you
their
out of
feet
that
again.
It's
environment.
housing first, not housing only, because there are very rich services. Like there's a team of people, really, whether they're social workers or social workers and nurses and psychiatrists, people with lived experience. It's like a support services team. And then the team says to you, how can I help you?
They provide wraparound support for me. So if I need assistance in getting things such as my ID or birth certificate, they help with that. They support me through that process. If I need to make appointments at the VA hospital, they support me through that process. Any and everything
Okay.
that I pretty much need done, I have support through Pathways to Housing.
Supporters of Housing
Nice.
First also argue that it's cost efficient. A comprehensive study in 2015 concluded that shelter and emergency department costs decreased with Housing First policies.
What people don't typically realize when they walk past a person who's homeless is that this person is costing taxpayers a lot of money. People get very sick when they're homeless. They have to be taken to the hospital. Sometimes they steal food. They have no money. They get arrested. Court costs,
Yeah.
police
Ah,
time,
yo, like
jail time.
personally, like during the time when we used to throw out food, I would always save like a cool crate of like sandwiches and whatnot, so I can pass around to like some of the homeless folks I saw. Like, yeah, man, like it would be so much better than for them to come in and then stealing, and then we have like this back and forth, and yeah, I would just rather just hey man, like if you don't mind, if you could wait, I got some food for you. Like they're expired food, but like it's only like they expire the same day. So here's a couple sandwiches. You're choosing. Go for it, man. And it really helped. Like, cause I used to like you know battle the homeless and whatnot. Like as weird as that sound, like not like like, but like I would have to be like, hey man, like put that down. Don't steal. Hey man, like, and it would be a back and forth. And I just felt like, dude, this is getting nowhere. They would come back, same issues, and then at some point, yeah, like a coworker said, me and a coworker kind of like, he's like, yo, why don't you just give them this food instead of throwing it away? And I was just like, that's such a good point. And from that point on, I kind of did that, and it helped. like it helped so much, like, you know, and I've always applied that, like, you know, like if I could, if I can, I would always just, you know, pass them like these foods, or like, heck, like, you know, they would be like cookies and sweets. Yeah, man, get that. Like it solved so much, and I feel it's so much better than robbing, getting, and then like having police involved and all this like extra stuff. It truly is.
When you tally up the annual costs of people who are homeless and very vulnerable, it turns out we're actually spending sometimes $50,000 a year or $100,000 a year in some cases. Yeah, and the person is still homeless.
But
Yeah.
perhaps the biggest advantage to Housing First is the improvement in the quality of life it provides.
Being homeless and being a parent, I kind of didn't want my child to see me in that situation. So it kind of put a
Yes,
wedge
kids
in our
now. That's
relationship for a
great.
little bit. But once I got housed now, I could provide a space where we can interact together, and she wouldn't have to be subjected to
Oh, he
that
had
lifestyle.
kids, but then he
Being
was
able to
going
have
through
my
that
housing first,
situation.
I know that I'm in control of my environment now. What happens here is all about what I create.
But Housing First also comes with its own set of criticisms.
Okay.
Experts like Stephen Ide from the Manhattan Institute believe that Housing First hasn't shown any real result.
When the
Yes, this is where I kind of wanted to like, cause this sounds great, but there's always like a good and a pro and a con to everything. Um, so I'm like super curious, what's the con to it? Like, what's the downside of like, you know, housing first? Because it sounds great. So yeah.
public is told that this particular policy is going to end homelessness, what they're expecting is that they're going to see fewer homeless people around, that homelessness numbers will significantly drop as a result of the implementation of this policy. And I don't think that we've seen that in the case of Housing First.
Critics also point out that Housing First might not be as cost-effective as it looks. Research in 2015 discovered that while permanent housing intervention was more successful in achieving housing stability, it was also more expensive than temporary housing. A 2018 survey by the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine also concluded that there is no published evidence to prove that permanent supportive housing improves health outcomes or reduces healthcare costs.
No government that I'm aware of has saved money by investing in homeless services through a housing first approach. You can talk about potential cost offsets. That is, if you invest $1 million in housing first, that will trim some of the budgets in some other service systems. You're not going to actually save money, reduce the cost of government to the point where you could be talking about, let's say, a tax reduction as a result of investing in housing first. So I think that there has been some misleading of the public with respect to that concern.
There is also the question of whether the need for housing actually triumphs over the need for treatment.
If we want more from people, we have to be talking about far more than just housing. But in the housing first era, there's a way in which housing just continues to suck all the air out of the room, and all we keep coming back to is, are we doing enough to expand the stock of subsidized housing to help the homeless?
Meanwhile, Dr. Simbaris argues that the criticisms towards Housing First are designed to blame those who are unhoused, rather than to assist them.
They want to go back to treatment and sobriety first, and then housing maybe, because that changes the entire narrative back to homelessness is the fault of the individual. Anybody who fails in a capitalist society like ours, with no, taxation and no government, is only because it's their fault.
Yeah, yeah.
Housing
And you
First
can't really
hit
say
its
that
first bump under the
with the
Trump
example
administration that
of
sought to replace it with
with the other man that, he lost his family and then he lost his house, and that's kind of where it started. It's kind of
programs
a
focused more on treatment and
there's
sobriety.
moments
They were
where
talking
just
about
life
housing
happens and
fourth
you
as a
have no other
policy,
option.
housing fourth, okay? And that was very deliberate because it's housing first. And they were like, no, housing fourth, treatment, sobriety, employment, and housing maybe. It was a very, very targeted attack.
The Biden administration, however, showed a return to Housing First. The American Rescue Plan Act of 2021 included 70,000 emergency housing vouchers and a staggering $350 billion in state and local fiscal recovery funds in an effort to aid homelessness and housing instability.
The Biden administration absolutely supports a housing first approach. They feel that in a society as ours, that housing should be a right and not a privilege.
Yep.
That every
I feel
American deserves a safe and stable place to call home. So they are, providing the resources and the support.
Critics of Housing First believe that lawmakers need to be giving more alternative policies a chance and approach the homeless crisis in a more structured manner.
We need to have them invest in a broad range of programs, residential programs, that can benefit the homeless population in all its variety, because the homeless population is very diverse. Within that framework, Housing First-like programs would have a place, low barrier programs would have a place, but they would not rule the roost in the way that they currently do.
Those in support of Housing First believe that more resources and support from the government are needed to truly end the crisis once and for all.
Well, if you don't have the resources in the program to deliver a place to live, then your listening and your promise to them is hollow. You need to have the listening, let's call that the policy, which is, housing first, person first. But then you need the resources behind the policy, apartments, subsidy, support services, in order to actually make the package viable. We're nowhere near where we need to be in investment, either of building public housing or affordable housing, having, the capacity to address the homeless problem. We're nowhere near it.
What's important is that homelessness is a crisis that can be solved as long as there is enough attention, care, and resources to support the cause.
It's just very disgraceful that in a country that's so blessed, so wealthy, that has done some things right in the past, if not everything, that we can't do something to fix this problem, or at least make it smaller, ameliorate it.
So there's a lot of good work going on. So that's what gives me hope, that we can actually turn the nighttime stars into a daytime, where we just turn up the lights enough to really end it for all. Because the other thing that gives me hope is we know how to do it. We have the cure. We have good examples of how it's done. We need to take it to scale.
Housing First sounds, I like it. I like it. I think it's a good idea. But taxing and whatnot. So, all right, let's look at what happens with
This episode is brought to you by CuriosityStream. Get free access to Nebula, the streaming platform built by all your favorite YouTubers.
So let's see how Finland solved their homeless crisis. See what they did.
When you sign up for CuriosityStream at the link below. About 600,000 people experience homelessness in the U.S. Think about your own life. You might not be homeless or necessarily even know someone who is or has been. But you certainly know someone paying too much for rent, someone having trouble finding a place to live, someone facing eviction. In other words, someone who could become homeless without much needing to go wrong. More and more Americans are joining this category every day. The truth is that in 95% of U.S. counties, those who work a full-time minimum wage job cannot afford even a one-bedroom apartment. Change that to a two-bedroom and the entire country becomes unaffordable. This situation is only getting worse. As a result of the pandemic, rising housing costs, wage stagnation, and the inadequate policies of our local and federal governments, the number of people experiencing homelessness and of people on the brink has been steadily growing for the past decade. That is, if you only look at the US. In this episode, we're looking at Finland's approach to homelessness, what Housing First is, and what it could mean for the American economy.
So
In Finland, only about 5,000 people, 0.1% of the population, are homeless. And that's even with the broadest definition of what constitutes homelessness, which includes more than who you typically think of when you hear the term. The Finnish definition of homelessness goes beyond just those who are living on the street or in emergency accommodations like shelters. In some cities, like the country's capital Helsinki, no one sleeps on the street. That type of homelessness has been completely eliminated. Compare that to the US's nearly 600,000 homeless people, which is almost exclusively
Okay.
so-called rough sleepers, those who live on the street, and the problem starts to become apparent. What's more important, though, is that homelessness isn't just low in Finland, it's actively going down. Between 2010 and 2018, Finland enjoyed a massive 40% decline in the homelessness rate.
Compared to US, which had a 30% increase at some point, if I remember correctly. Like,
If it sounds like we're cherry-picking data, even during the pandemic, which, let me remind you, has caused a massive surge of homelessness in the US, homelessness in Finland did not increase. So what happened? How is Finland so effectively reducing homelessness? In 2007, the Finnish government started a national Housing First program. Housing First is a philosophy that argues that to make progress on homelessness, particularly chronic homelessness, you need more than temporary emergency solutions. You need permanent housing right out the gate. In other words, housing is the starting point, not the end point. The way Housing First programs work is pretty simple. People experiencing homelessness receive independent housing immediately, without having to first fulfill mental health, sobriety, income, employment, or other requirements. Once they're housed, support services are offered, not imposed, and over time, the newly housed begin to finance part of the cost of their housing to the degree that they can afford it. It sounds pretty intuitive, but this is very different from the more common continuum of care or staircase approach we're mostly using. In continuum of care programs, homeless people are expected to make progress on any mental health or addiction issues they may have, and to pass a certain standard before being housed. In this system,
so that's like, oh, that's the housing fourth that the other guy was speaking about, where you have to do sobriety check, certain, you know, this is what the other guy was talking about for housing fourth. And I feel like there's like, I don't know, obstacles. Like the obstacles can be very, if you're already down your luck, you don't have, you know, everything is just in the hole, in the shitter. And you know, for you to try and, you know, get that self like want, it can be hard sometimes. And for you to have to do all these obstacles where, you know, just so you can get into a shelter or a house, it could, you know, it could really demotivate, like unmotivate you. It could like dishearten you, and you're just gonna be like, well, it is what it is. Like, I guess this is my life. Compared to housing first, it kind of like you get the shelter, it puts you out of that state of like chaos of like drugs, people going crazy, people are like having mental issues like sanity, and just kind of like you're able to like kind of hone yourself for a bit, and like that, I feel like you can get a better grip of like self if you have your own house, and like, you know, you can, and then you start moving to the next process. Okay, there you go.
housing is at the top of the staircase. These individual changes that these programs require are the sorts of things that are incredibly difficult to address when you are still contending with the anxiety of not having a home, possibly still sleeping on the street. In these continuum of care programs, only once you have demonstrated some change, which we should keep in mind is incredibly difficult to achieve without housing stability, do these programs graduate you into housing arrangements. First shared housing, and slowly over time, independent housing. To some, continuum of care approaches sound great. That is, in theory. They map onto our society's values of meritocracy, of security. Only those who are deserving get access to the prize of having a home. Under this mentality, if you don't have a home, it must be because you're just not good enough yet. Come back later. It should be obvious that these programs just don't work. Not only do they strip people of their agency and come with an enormous moral burden, but recidivism is high, and a huge number of people don't make it into the program in the first place because of the high barrier to entry. Compare that to Housing First. In the initial study on Housing First, back in 2003, a randomized trial of the two approaches decidedly shows the strength of the new program. Around half of the initially homeless group were accepted into permanent housing, regardless of their eligibility according to other programs, and they were then offered tailored and optional care for their individual circumstances. The other half went through conventional channels, and at the end of the trial, the results were clear. The Housing First group spent more time in stable housing, less time hospitalized, and results carried over for longer than when homeless people went through the continuum of care path. Within just 6 months, Housing First had virtually eliminated homelessness in the experimental group. It was a massive success. That first study was in New York, and inspired by its promising results, the EU ran its own pilot programs in 5 European countries with the same outcome: secure, long-term housing stability. And now that it's become the official national policy of the Finnish government, we've seen just how much good this can achieve. It is abundantly clear that this approach works. Despite all of this, some of you might still be skeptical. Forget for a second that housing is a universal right we are all entitled to, that it is baked into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which the US has signed onto and agreed to provide in front of the entire international community. Forget that this right doesn't include temporary shelters, but only real, stable housing, and that there are metrics around accessibility, affordability, discrimination, and protection from eviction which good Housing First programs conform to perfectly, in addition to affirming the basic idea of being decent to real human people. You might still wonder about costs in the wealthiest country in the world that regularly provides housing subsidies mostly to the wealthiest people in the country through mortgage interest tax deductions costing the American people, I don't know, $70 billion a year, or close to 25 times what is set aside for homelessness programs at the federal level. Imagine all that incredibly important stuff doesn't matter. It's gone. Forget about it. Housing First is still cheaper than not housing people or walking them through an ineffective continuum of care program. Not only are people housed through Housing First covering part of the cost and are more easily employed, but housing people saves money in the long term on comparatively costly emergency hospitalization bills and absurdly expensive policing, which both go down when 1. People's needs are taken care of preventatively, and 2. They aren't exposed to an expensive state apparatus that has criminalized existing without a house. Given all this evidence, you're probably...
Wait, what was the guy's argument for Housing First? Okay, so I kind of want to go back to his what he thought was wrong with Housing First or its flaws.
Believe that Housing First hasn't shown any real result.
When the public is told that this particular policy is going to end homelessness, what they're expecting is that they're going to see fewer homeless people around, that homelessness numbers will significantly drop as a result of the implementation of this policy. And I don't think that we've seen that in the case of Housing First.
Critics also point out that Housing First might not be as cost-effective as it looks. Research in 2015 discovered that while permanent housing intervention was more successful in achieving housing stability, it was also more expensive than temporary housing. A 2018 survey by the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine also concluded that there is no published evidence to prove that permanent supportive housing improves health outcomes or reduces healthcare costs.
No government that I'm aware of has saved money by investing in homeless services through a Housing First approach. You can talk about potential cost offsets. That is, if you invest $1 million in Housing First, that will trim some of the budgets in some other service systems. You're not going to actually save money, reduce the cost of government to the point where you could be talking about, let's say, a tax reduction as a result of investing in Housing First. So I think that there has been some misleading of the public with respect to that concern.
There is also the...
Okay, so, you know, it is expensive for you to try and continue this Housing First.
Covering part of the cost and are more easily employed, but housing people saves money in the long term on comparatively costly emergency hospitalization bills and absurdly expensive policing, which both go down when 1. People's needs are taken care of preventatively, and 2. They aren't exposed to an expensive state apparatus that has criminalized existing without a house. Given all this evidence, you're probably wondering, why aren't we doing this? To be fair, there are some small-scale examples of this in the US. The US Department of Housing and Urban Development does fund certain homelessness programs, some of them with the Housing First methods. However, these programs are only robust in a few cities and states. But no matter the nature of the program, whether it's Housing First, continuum of care, or something else, funding is far too low. The HUD's budget and municipal aid funds have steadily declined over time, and as a result, programs scrape together a budget from the general public and several different local and federal funds, rarely ever amounting to what they actually need to provide effective services. But the main problem behind all of this isn't that homelessness programs aren't getting enough funding. That is an issue just a little further down the line. The underlying problem is affordable housing, and at the core of that problem is our capitalist organization of the economy. Under a capitalist economy, housing isn't treated like the right it's considered to be by most nations, including, on paper, the United States. Instead, it's a commodity, something to be traded, speculated on, turned for a profit. That is the main goal of housing in a commodity market,
world of business.
not putting people in homes, making money. As a result, developers, investors, and the like don't focus their energy on housing the poor, from whom they can only extract so much, but rather on building luxury accommodations for the wealthy, leaving largely empty units across the country only rarely occupied, if at all, while
That's
people
facts.
in desperate need of
We don't
housing
need
are refused
big-ass
access
mansions.
and subjected to a manufactured housing scarcity. On top of that, there is a very real incentive for capitalists to only partially resolve homelessness. The threat of losing the roof over your head keeps even the most exploited worker in a job they hate. Increasingly, that threat forces people into even more dire conditions as wages become less and less sufficient to cover housing costs, forcing people to take on several jobs and work untenable hours to avoid the possibility of eviction. It is not in the capitalist interest to remove that powerful, terrifying incentive. And here is where the Finnish success story may go beyond Housing First alone. Not only is Housing First doing a good job of taking people out of homelessness in a reliable way, but a social democratic organizing of the economy is limiting the extent to which people are likely to fall into it in the first place. It's still capitalism, so it still relies on somebody being exploited, in this case people in the global south, but at the very least, social democracy goes part of the way on neutering perverse capitalist incentives on continuing homelessness domestically. One key element of this is unionization. High unionization at 75% of the Finnish workforce, and therefore higher wages and higher job security than in freer markets, mean that as people exit homelessness, they are unlikely to be replaced or fall back into it themselves. American conservatives love to rail against Housing First, touting its failures to make significant changes in cities like Los Angeles, where homelessness has continued to rise despite Housing First programs taking root. What they conveniently forget to mention is that the continuum of care programs they prefer still deliver worse results. And the core issue of the skyrocketing housing prices in the free market is why people are even pushed out into homelessness in the first place. The thing is, it doesn't have to be this way. There are solutions to reduce the scale of this issue. Earlier this year, the Gravel Institute released a great video on one of these solutions, the decommodification of housing. I'll put a link to that video and all of the sources for this one in the description. At the end of the day, the conclusion that you should take away from the Finnish case isn't just that this one type of program works really well at taking people out of an incredibly difficult situation for the benefit of everyone. It does do that, but that's not the point. The Finnish example gives us a glimpse of how we can treat housing differently. Instead of being a game for the wealthy to gamble their own fortunes and the livelihoods of millions of Americans, Housing First shows us what housing really is: a necessity, a right. It's something that must come before almost everything else, something which we must guarantee, or fail to recognize the humanity of millions of people.
Real.
If you're interested in what the future of housing might look like, I highly recommend you check out Home of the Future on CuriosityStream. It's a fascinating look at cutting-edge production methods and radically different approaches to housing than those we see today. CuriosityStream is an established streaming platform with a solid track record of caring about great educational content and the financial security of those who produce it. They've got thousands of nonfiction titles from some of the best filmmakers in the game. As you probably know, YouTube doesn't treat its creators very well. That's why some of my YouTuber friends and I teamed up to build Nebula, so we don't have to worry about demonetization. As educational creators ourselves, we love CuriosityStream, so we've worked out a deal, where if you sign up for CuriosityStream at the link below, you'll also get access to Nebula, 100% free. That's less than $15 a year for both CuriosityStream and Nebula, which, in my humble opinion, is a pretty great deal. Since you're already on the internet watching my video, why not spend some time learning about fascinating topics on CuriosityStream? Or check out Nebula's original content, including my upcoming series on the resurgence of fascism. You can also watch all my videos as they
Fascism.
were intended, ad-free. There really is something for everyone, and by signing up at the link below, you're helping us produce more content without the fear of demonetization. Give CuriosityStream a shot, and get free access to Nebula when you sign up using the link below. It really does help support my channel and educational creators all across YouTube. If you enjoyed this video and you'd like to see more like it, consider subscribing to stay up to date with my latest episodes.
Yeah, definitely subscribe and like. Second thought, amazing content. Uh, yeah, no, from what I seen, like housing first, even if it's like, expensive, like I feel like it's it's beneficial. Like it will help out a lot of people. Um, if only the politicians, like, it always falls back on the politicians. Like, man, like I feel like, okay, if you don't want to have it, like, find the middle ground, man. Like, just find the middle ground, for God's sake. These people are homeless. These people are going through the worst. Like, I always feel bad for this homeless man that I saw get talked down to, and we don't know his situation. And this man goes up to him and he says, um, he starts basically just telling him either delete yourself or move, like do something, like, like it gets something going. But if he's like, already going through the dumps, and he has like, addictions and all those other sorts of things, and maybe he's tried to get help, maybe he's tried through the continuum of care, maybe he's tried, you know going over those obstacles, and somehow some way he's found himself falling back down this, like, that spiral of, like, you know of, like, just not being of drugs, that spiral of drugs. Then, what else could you do? Like, yeah, like, I always feel bad for that one guy, because he got this talk. That guy came up to him and started talking nasty, and it was just, bro, like, I was questioning that man. Like, I know you feel like you being harsh. Being harsh is okay, but you got to read the room here. Like, that man was super down. Like, he wasn't in his best at his like he wasn't in his best moments of life. And you over here just telling him, go delete yourself. If you're why you here, if you ain't going to do nothing, and all these sorts of nasty stuff, man. It was horrible. It was genuinely horrible. And I feel like the housing first could benefit a lot of people when it comes to the homelessness.